So we're going to be going over metrics tracking now. So this is basically going to be diving into the different analytics tools out there and kind of going over just some common things that you guys should take note of. So some of the stuff is going to be a little bit more on the technical side, but still, even if you're on the non-technical side, I think there's still a lot that you can glean from this. I'm guessing there's probably going to be quite a few questions throughout this, so just raise your hand whenever there's a question on something, and I'll try and get to it. But basically, all the analytics tools that I'll be kind of talking about, everything boils down to events, properties, and people. So if you haven't used a people-based tracking system before, it's going to be pretty important to understand how it differs from non-people-based tracking. So basically, events are things that happen on your website. It can be anything from a page view to a button click to someone signing up to a purchase. It's just something happened. It's an event. People are going to be the users or accounts. Sometimes those are going to be people that actually have a login. Sometimes you actually want to create people for people that don't quite have an account yet. It might be tied to just email. And then properties are basically context on both the people as well as the events. So for people, it might be their first name, their last name, their age, number of transactions. Events is going to be stuff like maybe you have 2 buttons on your site that are different colors and you want to keep track of what button color it is. You're doing an A/B test. It could be the product name that's being purchased, the amount that something cost. Those are all going to be properties that add context to your events. There's also a distinction between client-side and server-side events. So client-side events and analytics tools are way easier to implement. Usually you can get by with only like a very surface level of JavaScript to implement anything. Server-side is going to require more integration. It's going to have to go into your back-end code. But the client-side on the other side is going to give you much easier to get stuff rolling and getting up with it. It's going to be not as consistent, though. Usually I see maybe around 5% or so of client-side events sometimes just go missing for whatever reason. Could be somebody's on mobile, they're on the subway and boom, they miss it right when the event's supposed to happen. It could be that, they have a really slow connection. Could be they're using some kind of plugin or software or using some network firewall that's not letting the events through. Client generally is a lot easier to get going with, and it's a lot easier to modify as you go forward. The server side is going to be a lot more work. But it's guaranteed to work pretty much all the time. You can have, let's just say that the analytics service is down. You can have a buffer, and when it reconnects, it can kind of send everything that was, missed before. So you can basically get to like 100% of events being sent to your analytics platform through the server side. But it is a lot more work to do. It also, what I would recommend using the server side for is going to be events that are more critical, so like purchase events. Usually makes sense to run through the server. Also, on the server side, you can send events that doesn't require somebody to be in their browser, right? So the reason we use this is, let's just say I have recurring billing set up. Somebody's not going to come to your website, the day that it rebills or whatever. To send that billing event that they, were charged again, that's going to have to go through a cron job or something on the server side. Right. So. Basically, these are the main tools to choose from for the people-based tool. This is kind of I would call it like mid-tier of analytics software. There's higher end too, where you're doing more stuff that it's going to be more of like a Redshift-based service, like Looker. There's a bunch of other ones out there too. But I would say for pretty much everybody at this stage, unless you have experience with a really, really high-end analytics tool, sticking with something like Amplitude or Mixpanel is kind of probably be your best bet. Kissmetrics is all right, but lately doesn't seem to be getting as many updates, and there's not as many features nowadays as Amplitude and Mixpanel. Between Amplitude and Mixpanel, it will kind of come down to cost and a little bit your use case. They provide pretty much the same features. I think Amplitude has basically replicated all the basic stuff that's in Mixpanel. The difference is going to be more so on Amplitude has some higher end plans eventually for machine learning and stuff like that on your data that it's actually pretty cool. I will say though that the Mixpanel interface seems to be a little easier to use. Amplitude's UX, UI is a little bit more behind, but they do have those higher end features for stuff. Then there's also Heap, which is primarily something that I would say it doesn't make as much sense for mobile apps. It's actually pretty decent for web. The way that one works is it actually tracks everything that happens. So every click, everything is recorded. You don't actually have to set up events ahead of time, which is cool, but it can be a little bit too much noise sometimes. So generally, I kind of push people in the direction of either Amplitude or Mixpanel if possible. And then there's Segment, which is basically, they have some of their own stuff now, but Segment is more or less kind of like a universal API for event systems that everybody should be using if you can, because it essentially lets you turn on, Google Analytics, Mixpanel, Amplitude, whatever else. So you can actually have Mixpanel and Amplitude running at the same time to kind of evaluate both of them if you wanted through Segment. All right, so why not Google Analytics for your more advanced data? Basically, Google, in their terms of service, does not let you track user-specific information. So if you wanted to tie something back to an individual user, to an email address, to exactly where somebody's coming through, you're not going to be able to do that through Google Analytics. There's hacks that let you do it, but I know people that have had their Google Analytics accounts just deleted because they were trying to actually get unique data in them. So just not a good idea, and it's not built for it either. The other side of it is that once you get past a certain point, I think it's around a million events or a million visitors per month, everything ends up being estimates instead of the actual numbers in Google Analytics, unless you pay for their super expensive premium plan. So you're not actually getting the raw numbers, which for events like purchases kind of ends up being a problem. They also don't make it really easy to do some of the event-based tracking. The event stuff that is in Google Analytics it's there. It's just not too easy to deal with, and there's not a lot of different ways that you can look at your event stuff. Plus, server-side events don't really exist. There's a way you can do it. It's just not recommended at all. On the other side of it, I think a lot of people, especially if you come from more of a tech background and your team has a lot of strong tech people on it, I've seen it quite often where people are just like, we don't need Mixpanel, we don't need that. We can just stick with our own database and write our own queries and stuff when we need to figure things out. And yes, that does work, but as you grow, not everybody in your company is going to be able to follow along. Using a real analytics tool will actually let everybody else in the company use it, even if they don't have a strong tech background. This is especially going to be true for people on the marketing side, right? Generally, you're not going to have somebody who's going to be in there and writing SQL queries for everything. You're going to want something that they can use in parallel with Facebook ads and Google ads and whatever else they're using. So having Mixpanel set up or Amplitude is a much better option for those people. Also, for your database side, once you start really getting into stuff and doing some complex analysis, you're going to run into problems unless you're using read replicas. So basically this means, if your queries are running on your live production database, you're going to run into conflicts there if you're running a big analytics query when a bunch of people are trying to access your site and your site's down because you're running a report. That's the worst situation possible. Also, just kind of aggregating data is not as easy to do when it's not set up for it. Your database is going to be structured for how your application works, not necessarily for running analytics. So it's just going to be harder to deal with. Stuff like graphing and visualizations and stuff like that, it's not going to come out of the box. You're going to have to set those up with D3 or something. So it's just not as easy to do. All right, so in terms of actually how to structure this stuff, the first thing you're going to want to do is start identifying things that you want to track, but being really, really careful that you don't start tracking everything. I think the biggest problem I see with people that start using analytics tools and moving to one after using Google Analytics for the first time is they're like, oh, shoot, we're going to track how many people click the email field and the password field and this button and that button and the scroll bar and all this stuff. And they've got 500 events in there, and 2 weeks later they just stop using their analytics tool, right? Because they're just like, I can't get anything out of this. There's just too much in here. So it's definitely really, really good to start small. Start with kind of the key things, so the different steps in your funnel. So if you were doing a lot of stuff around your checkout, you might first start with step 1 is billing information, step 2 is payment information, and then it's the thank you page. So 1, 2, 3, those are just your events that you're firing in your funnel, And then it might be that you find out, like, okay, we really want to improve the second step. And then you'd go back and kind of add in more events for the things in that individual page. You might ask, once again, like, why not just start with that from the start? And I think it's just because too many of those things change, and it just ends up building like a lot of backlog in your analytics tools. One problem that all these tools have is it's not really easy to delete stuff, right? So if you have some events in there that were for a page that you don't really use anymore, it's not the easy thing in the world to get rid of that information, and then it just kind of, it's not a big deal, but it kind of gets annoying sometime every time you're in your analytics tool and all this stuff that you don't use anymore keeps showing up. So that's another reason to kind of avoid that. The other side with this is, and I'll show you farther along here, I kind of have a template that I've used in the past, but creating a standard naming structure and sticking to it and kind of like just sharing that with the whole company. You're going to want everybody on the same page, because right now it might be just one person is in charge of kind of setting up the analytics and the events and stuff like that. Eventually, as you grow, you'll have more people, and people will come in and, you know, one person decides to have everything in camel case, another person decides to use underscores between all the event names, and then it just kind of turns into a mess. The next thing here is something called super properties, which for whatever reason, I think all the analytics software out there really has super underwhelming documentation. I'm not sure why this is, but they just don't have the best documentation for things. And so there's these things called super properties that when you're implementing stuff, you should definitely look into more. But most analytics tools don't kind of like put it on the surface. But they're basically properties that get sent with every event. So normally when you're going in there, you might set up like your add to cart event, and it's like, okay, you're adding to cart 3 red shirts, right? And those are the properties that get sent with it. Later on, you might have a sign up event, and with a sign up event, you might be sending the email address, or did this person check to receive newsletter updates as the properties that get sent with it. And those are properties that only go as the single events. Super properties are a list of things that actually you kind of set up once in the analytics tool, and you kind of set up once in your code, and they get sent with every single subsequent event. And this stuff is actually really useful. So for stuff like number of user projects, or like the total lifetime value of a user, it's really cool to send this stuff as super properties, because you might have lifetime value as a property on that person. But every time they make a purchase, right, so the lifetime value being the total amount of money that they've spent on your site, every time they purchase, that number is going to increase, right? So if you wanted to go back in time and see, like, okay, people who have spent less than $100 that are shopping on the website, like, what are their behaviors? You can't go back in time and do that, because now that all those people's properties are a higher number because they've gone farther into it. If you actually had the amount of money that they spent sent with every single event, it makes it a little easier to kind of roll back in time and see where different things are. So kind of for like some of the high-level metrics and like the one metric that matters type stuff, if you can put that stuff in there as super properties, it makes it really easy to kind of go back and look at snapshots of like, okay, let's look at events that were performed by people that had 1 project, and then eventually they get to having 5 projects. Like, what do we need to do to get more people from having 1 project on our site to 5 projects? And those are the things that you're going to be able to look at with super properties. And I don't know how well this is catching, just explaining this up here, because this is kind of it's a weird concept the first time you look at it. So I definitely recommend just kind of like looking up, super properties Mixpanel, super properties Amplitude, and reading their page for it. It's not easy to find on their website right away, but it's a good thing to kind of look into more. Any questions on any of this stuff so far? Cool. Next thing here, this is more specific to people that have apps, but first thing being that if you have analytics on your app, make sure that you're double, triple checking everything. The biggest problem I've seen, especially when you've got a marketing person that's kind of saying, hey, this is stuff that we should track, and then just giving it to developer. Developer goes out, throws all that stuff in, tests it once on their phone. They're like, okay, cool, it works. They ship the app, and like it doesn't work for anybody else. I think that it's really easy for this to happen with analytics, because it's not like something that you can just go through and give the app to everybody else in your team and have them check the flow on it. You actually have to go into the system and see, hey, are these analytics events getting sent through? So really make sure you have those right, because for the mobile stuff, you got to go through that whole process of waiting for your app to get approved again if you break something and need to fix it. A couple of just like tips here is if you're using Android, The Google's SDK passes in a lot of the install source information sometimes. You can relay that back to your analytics platform and get a little bit more information about where people are coming from when they're downloading your app. So definitely take advantage of that. If you're using iOS, you can kind of get the same information if you use Branch. It's just basically a tool that makes it easier to track where people are coming from when they install. On the other side of that, if you're going to be using the Facebook Ads SDK at all, make sure that you integrate that and set up kind of purchase registration events. Make sure they're pushing through, as well as tying in the identifier on Facebook Ads to your Mixpanel stuff as well. Definitely helps. And on that note, I'd also say that there's some stuff you can do with the Google SDK as well, but the Facebook one's just a little bit cleaner to use on mobile. With this, I think you can actually set this up through Segment as well. I haven't tried that yet, though. All right, so your next step is going to be basically adding your people in. So you've got your events, you've got the super property set up. Now you actually need to get all the people into your analytics platform. For this, you're going to choose an identifier to go off of. I've seen a lot of people use emails. Why are emails maybe not the best way to permanently identify somebody? They change, yeah. So people change their email, all of a sudden it screws it up, and they're a new person in your analytics tool. So instead, if you're using any form of database, you should have some unique ID that's generated in your database. Use that as your user identifier, not an email. That's really important. And then you're basically going to import all the people from your current database into your analytics tool. This is something where I just go and kind of read the documentation. There's not a whole lot of, it's not too hard to do for these. Some of them you can just take a CSV, so just do a dump of your current users in a CSV and then just upload it into their tool, and then all of a sudden all your users are in there, and if they log in again, you're going to be able to get data on them. And then on the people properties is where you should be storing additional information that's kind of universal to that person, stuff that you might not necessarily put in the events. But stuff like the date that the trial ends, the date they first came and signed up, how many times how many products they've bought, all that type of stuff. There's certain events too. I have on here like store key event dates and count. I found it useful a lot of times to put in things like how many times they've been billed. So like number of subscriptions billed, the last time that they were billed. That's all good stuff to store on the user. And to be honest, what I was saying with the events, you might want to be a little bit more careful of not tracking too much. With the people side, I really feel like anything that you're kind of storing in your database as an attribute on a person can help you in your analytics tool. There's not really a reason to avoid it unless it's going to be a ton more work to get it in there, but usually that's not going to be the case. The final thing here, and this is really, really important. I should have probably bolded this, but all these analytics tools, the way that they track user logins is usually something called identify. And then they have like an alias as well that you use around the sign up and login. And this is something that you need to test really, really, really well, because I've seen so many people screw this up where if a user logs out and then logs back in, it will or logs in with a different account, it mistakenly will merge those two accounts. I've also seen it before where it just then considers it as a guest user. It's just really, really important that you set up where people are getting identified, basically tying their browser session to a user session in the right place. And then also, the first time they sign up, making sure that you're correctly linking that as well. And for these, it differs a little bit per analytics tool, but definitely make sure that you're testing that stuff as much as possible. The final thing here would be the revenue tracking. This is actually pretty easy stuff to do. A lot of times you can actually kind of put this on your purchased event and push it through, and then just tag your purchased event as like, hey, this is a revenue generating opportunity, and then it'll kind of track stuff with that. Mixpanel is a little bit different in how it handles it, but it's the same type of thing. It's basically the same way that you're pushing people and event information. You're just kind of pushing transactions in as well, and just making it easier to kind of use some of the revenue tools that they put out there for you. Then the final thing here, just document everything. I have a template here that I've used quite a bit in the past. This is really, really basic, but it actually works pretty well to keep everybody on the same page. And when you're first starting out, it's really easy to avoid the temptation of just not putting this stuff in here and just kind of being like, okay, we'll write it down on a piece of paper, we'll figure it out. We know what we need to be tracking. And then in a few months, you'll go back to it and not remember. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's a great point. So single-page apps is going to basically function the same way as a mobile app in terms of tracking. It really is not too hard. You know, Google Analytics on a single-page app is just a complete nightmare in comparison. With most of these, though, because they're based off events and not page views, single-page app versus a traditional website doesn't really matter. It's just you're just linking into the actual events. But yeah, so this is a template that I usually use. It's pretty simple. This kind of in the left column is tracking, has this been implemented or not, just so your team can kind of keep into touch. If somebody adds a new thing in here, they'd put it back as work in progress or whatever. And it's basically you're just putting the event, putting the trigger, putting in the property names, like an example of what it might be. So if you purchased, amount, just kind of like informing everybody, like, okay, this stores a number. It'd be like $50.99. The plan, that's not an ID number. We're actually storing whether it's monthly or yearly. And then just kind of having a description on here. It's really, really simple stuff, but it's good to put this stuff down up front because as you grow, people are going to forget. You're going to bring new people into your team. People aren't going to understand what the events are. It might have seemed really, really clear to you what sign up was, but now you've got an email newsletter, you've got a trial plan, you've got something else, and people are like, what sign up is that for? So making sure that you kind of get the event names down and you document this stuff is going to be really important. I didn't. Did he go over this stuff a bit more? Ah. Yeah. For sure. Honestly, if that's something that you think is going to be pretty crucial to track how certain people that answer that behave, was Qualaroo or was he using a Hotjar? Okay, Qualaroo, yeah, because I think that's his. Yeah, especially if it's something like it's asking for like an NPS score, right? Because then you can actually store that on users and stuff and see like, okay, people that gave us a really high NPS score, how are they using the product differently, So yeah, if there's other tools and stuff, even like one I've seen quite often is people that use like Intercom, right? You put like started a live chat as an event, and then they'll actually store like how many messages that person sent too, right? Because it might end up being that like people that are really active in your live chat end up having a much higher LTV, so you're like, okay, we just got to get better at like having live support for people. So yeah, all those like kind of auxiliary things make sense to track as well. Yeah. 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 That's a hard one a little bit. He asked about event naming and like kind of what's the best strategy to follow with that. I think it's kind of just agreeing on something from the start. It depends because I've seen it. Sometimes people have like three different, like almost three different products that all funnel into one, right? And so then it's like, okay, how do you name those events? Because you're kind of like signing up for different services, but it's all the same thing. So I think it's kind of come down to like just sketching out on a board a little bit. Generally, though, what I'll do is I personally am not a huge fan of doing like lots of underscores and stuff like that. I'll usually just like write it in plain text, like register, and then it might be sign up flow :step 1, sign up flow : step 2, and just kind of a lot of times I'll just put like what section of the website and then a colon after or whatever else to kind of like dive in a little bit more. So it's not just something like step 3, right? Like what's that? Like putting it back to some portion or flow that it's attached to. And if you've got like a specific case, I can sit down with you too and go over it a little bit more. All right, cool. Come on. Whoops. I don't know why this is not. Okay, there we go. Yeah. All right, so here's just some like developer-centric tips here. Really use Segment. There's not a whole lot of reasons not to. It just makes it a lot easier, and it makes it really easy to move between platforms, or if you want to add something in that's doing, email automation or something else as well and needs to be tied into your events. Super easy to use. The cool thing is they actually have some features now where you can actually, let's just say that I added Mixpanel today, but I've been using Segment for the last 6 months. It'll actually roll back and fill it in with all your past information as well. So it's really good platform to use. Even if you're not necessarily using their service, they have some open source like libraries that are really good for aggregating events as well. Much better than the out-of-the-box libraries that come from the analytics tool companies. Yeah, then also make sure that you're defining all your super properties in a function or a class or something. Really easy to do. Just kind of like putting all your super properties in one space. So it's really easy to kind of go in there and add more if you need to. Generally means you're kind of having a bunch of database queries and everything all consolidated in one area. Just makes it easier. Then always test in a development account first. There's no reason not to have a dev and live version of your analytics. Just make sure you have that set up and make sure that you have it very, very clearly sandboxed so that your development data is not going to live. I've had too many companies that I've consulted with, and we get in there and it's like, wow, what's this like spike in your data? This is kind of crazy. Let's figure out what happened. And we're racking our heads over it for a week, and then they finally realize like, oh yeah, our developers like just pushed a bunch of stuff through there, right? So they had like all these purchase events that were coming through, but they didn't have any money in their bank account from it. We were trying to figure out what was going on. It was just a bunch of fake purchase events that got sent through. So always make sure that you're testing that out. Most of those analytics tools actually have a live view, so you can go in, and this is where it's kind of the most helpful area to QA. But they'll have a live view, and then you can do whatever you're doing on your app, and it will just all show up live what events were occurring. Really easy way to debug. And then finally, just make sure that there's really good communication about this stuff. Too many people kind of treat analytics a little bit casually, and it's just like, okay, we've got it set up, it's working. We'll just let Tom keep owning that. And then something gets changed, and Tom didn't tell anybody. So make sure that if you're changing anything with events, you guys communicated it. And I think that's why using some form of a spreadsheet, if you want to use that template, or if there's something similar, just have some area where it's kind of written down and everybody knows what's going on with the analytics events. Next thing here, if you're making big changes, add annotations. It makes it really useful so that in 6 months when you're looking back at your data and you're like, oh yeah, why, 4 months ago we had that big spike and things did really well. Why was that again? Having these things in there are going to tell you a lot more information. So just use the annotations. It makes it really simple to go back to old data. All right, now this is just a few different ways to analyze data. Does anybody else have questions on tracking before I move into this at all? Yeah, what's up?
We're free user accounts, so we can track the data.
Okay, so the question was that their pre-user accounts are just using emails right now. So is it just like basically kind of like a lead page is what you have? Is it just like a lead capture right now, or? Okay. And so you're not storing these in the database, you're using like MailChimp or something to build an email list? Okay. Yeah, so if you don't have distinct user accounts, you can use emails to do it, and then later transition off of that. It works. It's just, because you don't have user accounts, people aren't going to be able to change their email either, so it doesn't really matter too much. But it is something to keep in mind that when you actually transition to user accounts, you can switch and start using IDs instead of emails. So it's not, for your case, it's something you can do. I've also seen it before where people generate kind of unique IDs and then to store it in a cookie on that person's computer. That also works. Danger there being if they clear their cookies or use a different computer, you're not going to be able to track those events from them. But if you don't have a sign-up, you're probably not going to be able to track cross-device anyways. So, cool. Anything else? Good. All right, so funnels. Everybody should know by now what a funnel is. Easiest tool to kind of track with. They're going to be your best friend when it comes to analyzing analytics. One thing in particular that all the major analytics tools offer for the most part is being able to segment funnels is really, really useful for a lot of things, particularly A/B tests. So going in there, for this one, it's okay based off of how many projects somebody had. Are they more likely to purchase or not? But this could definitely be something where it's like, based off of what color the button was that they clicked, or if you integrate with Optimizely, so if you're using Optimizely for A/B tests, you can just integrate it one click with Mixpanel, and it will actually let you choose a different experiment that was run. So you could see, like, based on what optimized experiment they were served, did their purchase conversion change at all? And Optimizely is going to give you some of these analytics themselves, but they're not going to be able to segment on things like user properties, right? Because they don't know about your data. Optimizely is just an A/B testing tool. They're kind of just seeing, how many people are going from step A to step B. Taking that stuff and going back into Mixpanel makes it really easy to kind of look at different trenches of users as well. So like this one, for example, is based off how many projects they have, how active they are with that. Doing stuff that's kind of like inter-product testing, this stuff is going to be really useful. Yeah, then you can filter within these segments as well. You know, so I could set up my funnel and actually have it so I'm only looking at people that had a video count less than 50, and I'm segmenting them by initial source. Learning how to use the filter side of this stuff is really, really important. Anybody coming from a technical background and having done SQL queries and stuff, this will be a little bit more familiar with. If you don't have that technical background, make sure you kind of figure out how to filter and search through your data in these tools. Some of the stuff isn't as always easy to figure out, but just kind of playing with it and making sure that you know, figure out how to answer the questions that you're asking it. The next thing here is cohort analysis. Has everybody heard of cohort analysis before? Yeah, for the most part? Okay. Cohort analysis is basically just a great way to look at retention. Anybody that's doing a SaaS product, if you don't have cohorts set up now, make sure that you get those set up. It's going to be really, really important. And not just basic cohorts. So this right here is just kind of like, okay, monthly subscription retention based on which month they started, how long did they stay in, and what was the retention like. For this particular product, you can see that they have a really big fall off between month 1 and month 2. So that second billing event, they're losing like half the people on that. And then once they get to like month 4 or 5, it gets a little bit more steady. Still not the best for retention. But what this does is I can go back and look at it and see like, okay, for whatever reason, it looks like the retention was a little bit, it used to be a lot better back in 2014, maybe because their product was still early launched and, you know, their first segment of users are people that were really qualified. But for whatever reason, people that started back then were just likely to stay on for the first few months a little bit longer. It makes it easy to track if you're making big product changes, how your retention is affected as it goes forward. Yeah. 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 Yeah, got you. So his question was basically, if they have, so they're a B2B company, so if they have 3 different organizations sign up in a month and each one of them has 50 employees that are going to be using the software, how does that affect the way that you look at cohorts? And so for that, I would say that it's basically, there's 2 levels of that. So on one level, cohort analysis is basically just how your product is working overall, right? So for that, if you know, you were checking retention rates basically, or how often people were coming back, and for your case, it might be our employees using our app at least once a week, right? And then this might be a retention graph by week of how people are using it. Looking at it by, first of all, like a month-based context is going to give you an idea of how your app is changing over time, right? So is your product getting better? Are people retaining longer? And that's going to be basically the same across all your clients, right? And then you're probably also going to want to dive in and also segment based off client too. So right now this is date based, right? It's off of the start month. It could also be off of the organization as well, right? So people that are at company A, their first week, second week, third week, fourth week, how does that compare to people that are company B and how they're using it? So it's just another thing that you can use in the cohorts, right? So cohorts are always going to be on the x-axis, it's always going to be time, but on the y-axis it might not be a specific start date. It could also be the company they're from or whatever else. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's a table. The other type of cohort analysis that this is a little bit easier to visualize how things are affected over time is going to be a graph-based. So that's the same thing that you were seeing before. This is just it graphed out. From here, it makes it a lot more easy to see for that particular product. Like, wow, okay, months 2 through 4 is where you're having all the drop-off. After that, you know, once they get through month 8, it steadies off. You know, it's still really low retention for this particular product. But you can kind of see now where that's happening. And then I can see things like, okay, this blue line has a lot better retention for those first 2 payment events. What was going on that month? What were we doing then that we can maybe replicate and do better over time? Yes, so that's cohort analysis. I think I kind of covered everything with that. Playing with different segments, trying to find outliers, using different things that you're segmenting by. So like I was just saying for companies, just choosing like people properties and see how those change over time too. You might find that there's a certain segment that, maybe it's an interest group that they've selected or something else that has a much better retention than the other one. But cohorts are basically going to be the easiest way to analyze your retention and also start building an idea of who your power users are, right? So the people that have the best graphs on that stuff are going to be the people that are coming back and using your product all the time, and probably the ones you're going to want to talk to when you start building more personas. So I think that's everything I've got for analytics here. Yeah.
In terms of analysis on your sort of power users,
Yeah.
what are like some specific, like as an example, who noticed when you had certain customers stay on the longest, and you think you then go back and figure out how many things they did, or what are some of the ways to sort of reverse that?
Yeah. So the question was, okay, basically once you get your power users, right, you have some idea of these people are staying on the longest, what's your next step with that? So yeah, the first thing I would do is kind of look back at the events and typical paths that people have on your website and see, are they actually converting a lot better through those, right? There might be a way to identify early on, it looks like our power users, like I was saying before, you're looking at the different properties in that user, they on average have 50 live chats per month versus 2 live chats for an average user. And starting to just kind of like look at those differences between what a benchmark user would be and the power user. I also think that a lot of times it's not the easiest thing to pull out all that stuff from your analytics tool, right? You've got, let's just say you have 100 events, knowing you're not going to go through every single event with that user group and try and find it out. Usually I'll actually get them to give me a little bit of information to let me target my search a bit better, right? So you just send out a survey to them like you would whenever you're doing persona development, getting results back from them so they're all like, oh yeah, we love this feature in particular, and then that gives me a little bit more of an idea of, okay, I'm going to dive into the analytics in this area of the site, right, and see if I can pull anything out there. I will say that we're probably about 3 to 4 years off from seeing where analytics software is completely based off machine learning. I've seen some really cool demos of people that are kind of building stuff on top of Mixpanel right now, and I think like in the next few years you're going to see a lot more of it where you don't have to start asking those questions as much, and it's kind of answered for you ahead of time, right? So it'll eventually be like, okay, here's where we know our power users are. Boom, 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 boom. Here's the things that they're doing that are like way different than the regular users. So it's coming. We're still in the age where we have to kind of scrape some of this stuff sometimes, though.
With those surveys, how many questions do you tend to ask? Like 5?
Yeah, I'd say 5 is generally like a safe number if you're just kind of, if you don't have anything special that you're giving them to do the survey. I think like 5 is about the limit for attention span usually. All right, any other questions on analytics? Cool. All right, well, thank you very much, guys.